Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of the FlowCast. And as we've been talking about through this first season of the reboot of the FlowCast, it's all about recovery. And last week we talked about the different life cycles that we go through with recovery, how it changes as we go from our teens and 20s to our 30s, 40s, and beyond. Now, this week we're going to get into talking about how do we measure recovery? Because if you're anything like me, you've probably gone through times where you felt that you weren't ready to perform at your very best. At least mentally, you kind of seemed like you were off and things weren't going very well for you as far as how you perceived recovery. But if you've compared that to some sort of measurement that you took externally to your own felt sensations around how stressed or how recovered you were, you may get a totally different answer. So, we're going to dive into how we use these different measurement tools for our recovery and also looking at our stress levels and make a more informed decision about what recovery and what stress levels actually mean, as far as giving you a tangible answer to know how recovered you actually are. So let's get into this episode. Now, first off, there are two different ways that we can measure recovery. There's subjective measurements and objective measurements. And I like to look at both of these together and build a more complete picture around that subjective or felt sense of recovery, as well as objective, which is more along the lines of numbers that you're looking at from some sort of external measurement device typically. Now, with the subjective measurements, these tend to be more qualitative measurements. So you're looking at things like asking yourself, how do you feel as far as stress levels go? Are you feeling off in some way? And how recovered are you? So if you've trained to a peak before, or even if you haven't, but how ready do you actually feel to perform? And you can kind of give this to yourself on a scale from 1 to 10 is how I like to do it. So, at some point in the morning, you can kind of look at like, what is your stress level on that 1 to 10 scale? And kind of use that to gauge your day, or also look at it at the end of the day, turning back on the overall day and what was your overall stress score, what was your overall recovery score as well, as far as maybe how you felt after you slept or before going to the gym, or even something like rating of perceived exertion in the gym. The RPE is another great way that we can subjectively measure our stress or our recovery, as well as our performance level. And even if you do choose to look into some sort of external measurement device, ultimately to help you to build a bigger picture of your recovery, it's important to work on developing this subjective awareness of your recovery and of your stress levels. First, let's talk a little bit about what objective measurements are. These are the actual tangible numbers about your recovery or about your stress levels. And these are quantitative numbers that you can look at. Things like your resting heart rate or your heart rate variability, which we'll do a full episode on in this upcoming season of the FlowCast. But using external measurement devices, they give you this quantitative data. It are things like even as simple as counting your heartbeats or looking at your breath rate per minute are things that we can look at for objective measurements that we can tie into what these mean in relevance to your recovery or to your stress levels. So now let's go a little bit deeper into each of these subjective and objective ways of measuring our recovery and ways of measuring our stress levels. First off, self awareness is a key to anything related to stress management, and recovery, because even if you're depending on some sort of external device to give you those hard numbers on your recovery or on your stress levels, if it doesn't actually align with how you feel subjectively and that self awareness around it, you still probably aren't going to perform at your very best. And so you're going to limit yourself without having this self awareness piece in place. So to me, I think that building self awareness around stress and recovery is super important to include. Like, we also can't and shouldn't depend on technology all the time. Sometimes there are bugs in the software that will impact those objective measurements and throw things off. And there's also just sometimes where we don't want to have those devices around or always have to reach for them as a way to determine if we're recovered or not and able to perform. And one of these situations that I always like to use as an example is before any strongman competition, I would always make sure that even if throughout the training leading up to it, I was looking very closely at my recovery so that I could perform my very best at each training session, as well as give myself enough time to recover fully and be as prepared as possible leading up to the competition in that last week. And this works the same for any type of recovery protocol that you're going through for any type of competition setting, or if you're just trying to perform at a peak. This can be typically physically, but also with any type of performance, whether it's musical, a business meeting or presentation that you're trying to do. Being primed and ready at your very best is something that allows you to just reach that higher level state and get into flow because everything is back to your optimal baseline as far as stress levels go and as far as replenishing everything that gets depleted over the the course of stressing yourself out with the intense practice that it takes to get prepared to be your very best. So, the morning of competition or the morning of any type of performance that you're looking to do is not the time to be looking at your recovery scores and asking yourself if you're stressed out or not. At this point, there's nothing you can do about that other than still go and perform at your very best. So, you don't want to be psyching yourself out by looking at some sort of number on your readiness score on Whoop or on an Aura ring and seeing that you are not ready to perform at your very best based on this objective data. Instead of psyching yourself out in this way, it's just time to perform at your very best. And you can look at it after the fact and kind of build more of a informed decision around how you're going to approach your next peak phase leading into something similar in the future. So, leaving our competition setting out of the equation, we don't want to be questioning ourselves in any sort of way on that morning of competition or performance of any sort. But some of these self awareness tools or questions that we can ask ourselves in order to get a better idea of how we feel and build that self awareness to tie into these objective measurements are things like, do I need more coffee than usual? If you're slowly ramping up the amount of coffee that you're consuming or caffeine of any sort, that could be an indicator that your stress levels are starting to spike more or that you just need more recovery, also more sleep time. And how did I sleep is another question you can ask yourself. You can kind of get an idea and a pretty good idea of your overall how well you can perform and sustain performance throughout the day based on how good your sleep was because it's so important and it is that recovery superstar for us to get good sleep and enough sleep for our needs. Now, an important point about how well you slept that is key to not sort of psyching yourself out again from these subjective measurements too is I think it's important to make sure you wait at least 90 minutes after waking before giving yourself a subjective scoring of your sleep because if you do it first thing in the morning and you're still groggy, it could be because of what time you woke up. And if you just came out of a deeper sleep phase and you're still overcoming that sleep inertia that we face in the morning. So it's totally normal to be groggy in the morning or to take some time to get ramped up, especially for somebody that's more of a night owl and finds that their chronotype tends to have that heightened state of performance later on in the day anyway. It's going to take you a long time to get into the day and get going. And so it's not good to just immediately score yourself poorly on sleep and wipe out any chance of having a more optimal day based on what you're mentally thinking about. But I think one more question that we can look at subjectively to build more self awareness is also how you feel upon waking. Are you fired up to get into the day and get going, even if it takes a little bit of time? Or is it something that you're dreading the whole day, your body hurts, or mentally you just feel really off? Those types of things can be an indicator too of stress just being too high for you, and you need to kind of dial it back in, manage stress in some way, whether that's, you know, prioritizing sleep for the next couple of days or whatever to make sure you're getting enough sleep, and incorporating some of the other stress management tools and strategies, whether that's breathing, meditation, doing some sort of lower intensity workout that's going to help you to get some good quality movement in without overtaxing yourself as well. And then the other self awareness piece that I think is a strong indicator of how recovered you are, slash, how stressed you are starting to get to that point of reaching that depleted state of burnout, or if that too muchness is just starting to overwhelm you, is noticing that itchy, agitated feeling that you experience. And are you turning to your vices more through your day or through the evening as a way to cope with the stress that you're experiencing, or as a way to reward yourself in a sense for needing to promote more recovery? Are you turning to those vices, those things that aren't actually promoting good recovery, but they are those dopamine hits that help you to combat your stress levels? Things like eating processed junk food that's not actually promoting great recovery for you and just adding in empty calories, turning to more TV or, drugs, alcohol, anything like that, that is just that quick dopamine hit, but not actually going to help you to recover better. When we start to turn towards these maladaptive coping mechanisms more, it's usually a sign that we are trying to cope with stress and just get some relief in that way. And if we can recognize this and have that self awareness around turning to these vices more regularly, it gives us the opportunity to, put into place some stop gaps, whether that's getting outside for a walk in nature or doing some of that deep breathing or meditation, or something that's going to also combat stress in a positive way, even if it's just as a partial sort of block towards these other vices like turning on the TV in the evening, or using that time more productively to stretch and mobilize. That's going to help your body in that recovery mode. So I find that turning to those vices more regularly, when you plop down in front of the TV and don't want to move a muscle, or you're reaching for that pint of ice cream in the evening, things like these often are because we are coping with stress that's not being addressed properly. And so it's maladaptive in the sense that it may, in the short term, feel good, but it's not actually solving why those stressors keep popping up long term. And we'll go into more about specifics on stress in another season of the FlowCast. I know we're talking more specifically on recovery right now, but it's important to note because all these different stressors in our life are the things that are impacting our recovery. The final piece to touch on for today on how to measure recovery, now that we've looked at some of these subjective measurements and we've got some of that self awareness questions that we can look into and build for ourselves, is looking more at the different external measurements that we can use to get this objective data about our recovery. Things like heart rate variability, and our breath rate are the ones that are most commonly going to be used for looking at our recovery or looking at how stressed we still are after a phase of recovery that we can turn to on a daily basis. There are also things like getting blood and urine measurements of cortisol levels or other stress hormones, but we're not going to go into detail on that because this is pretty unuseful for most people. We're not going to be able to just go to a sports performance lab and get these tests done regularly. This is useful data because it's how we know that burnout is a real thing and that we can look at these numbers in Olympic athletes or elite performers and see when that stress becomes that point of burnout and depletion of the sympathetic nervous system, and our cortisol is just peaking because we no longer can um, mount an adrenal response with epinephrine. And so it's good to know that blood and urine measurements are possible external ways to look at our recovery, but not very useful for us just looking at getting a better sense of performing our best on a daily basis. Now, with heart rate variability, we'll talk about more in a full episode on heart rate variability and breath rate. The important thing to note is that it's looking at trends more than looking at specific numbers, because you could look at your breath rate and see that it's, you know, 13 breaths per minute, 14 breaths per minute, whatever number, and kind of assume that you're in a slightly stressed out or not fully recovered state, because ideally breath rate above 12 breaths per minute indicates that you are in a stressed out state. It should be below 12 breaths per minute, but everybody's different. And same thing with heart rate, depending on what medication somebody is on or their just overall general fitness, their resting heart rate might not be below 60 beats per minute or 50 beats per minute. And it might not reduce as much when they're sleeping either. So it's good to know that there's certain sort of baselines that are more optimal for everybody, but also to more so recognize what your situation is, because that's actually going to be what's going to help you to perform your very best. So looking at something like heart rate, and you can do this with some sort of device, whether it's an Apple Watch, a Whoop, or a Ring, a Fitbit, to look at your heart rate. And most of the devices will also look at breath rate. And you can get these numbers. These are often tied into what those algorithms on the devices use in order to give you a score of your readiness or your recovery level or stress level, whatever the device is going to use as that naming for it. But look at the trends that it's giving you. So maybe the optimal way is not to immediately just try to use this device when you're already in a stressed out state, but to try to get a baseline first. Although wherever you start, it's just good to look at how it changes over time, what the average is over different spans of time, so that you can see where the trend is going, as well as look at specific slices that tend to peak into a more stressed out or a less recovered state as well. Like, one bad score doesn't really mean anything unless you also have a baseline to compare it to. And I think this is especially true for heart rate variability, because each of the devices, and I found this by comparing different devices, whether it's an Oura Ring, a Whoop, a Fitbit, an Apple Watch, you're not going to get the same numbers on any of these different devices, whether it's due to just slight differences in their algorithms and how they measure your heart rate variability, and the way that or their accuracy as well. But the good thing about being able to choose any of these devices that are accessible to us is that they do tend to be consistent with the numbers that they give you. So if you choose, or if you already have a Fitbit or a chest strap heart rate monitor, you can totally use that to look at your recovery scores and give yourself an objective measurement of recovery, because you want to start building out these trends over time. You can track this usually within whatever app comes with the device, but you can also just write it down on paper and look at things like that resting heart rate, or most of them will do heart rate variability now, and track like your breath rate as well, and use these different numbers to see what the trends look like over time. Usually people will find that there are peaks throughout the week where their recovery is less ideal or their stress state is higher, and you can start to build a more informed decision around these other parts of your performance based on that. So if you know that you always have a stressful meeting on Thursday that causes you to, drop off in your readiness to perform your very best, it either means that you need to get enough extra sleep and recovery, Thursday night going into Friday, or it means on Friday you're not going to be doing a max effort workout that's going to stress you out that much more and that you aren't totally ready to perform for anyway. So making these informed decisions and these subjective decisions based on what you start to learn as you build a database for yourself from external measurements of your recovery is an important way to use it, rather than just looking at thin slices and not really using that data for anything as far as your recovery and as far as your performance goes, and also how to manage stress so that you're not burning yourself out. Now, like I said, there is a lot more that we can go into with heart rate variability and how we can improve our HRV and understanding the number better as far as it relates to our performance and our recovery. So we'll go into that in much more detail in a full episode of this season of the FlowCast. That's all I really need to say about the different ways that we can measure recovery. If you've got any specific questions or you've noticed anything with yourself that comes up either subjectively or objectively with a device, so leave a comment if you're watching this on YouTube, or send me a message if you're listening into the podcast anywhere else. Remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe on whichever podcast platform you like listening. And until the next episode, thank you for tuning in, and find your flow.